Hi folks, we are talking about geopolitics and supranationalism, and we are on video 4 of the political geography unit. You should take a second to set up your notes. First, we're talking about geopolitics, and geopolitics is the interplay among geography, politics, power, and international relations. And that seems really complicated. So when you think about geopolitics, you should ask yourself two questions. Who are the most powerful countries in the world, and how did they become so powerful? So we're going to go through some geopolitical theories about how countries become powerful, but it is important to know that these theories have solid foundations in World War II and the Cold War, and they have historic applications. Okay, so the first theory is RATZEL'S organic theory. He argues that acquiring territory, so an expanding country that takes over land, is essential for a country to survive. He said that a country, just like a person, has a natural lifespan, and that the only way to continue living as a country was to continue acquiring territory. This theory becomes popular in the 1930s and is used by Hitler to justify Nazi expansion in the 1930s. So he claimed that the German people needed Lebensraum, or living space, and so that's why he was taking over all of Europe. And so Ratzel argued that, again, countries are just like human beings. They need to eat or to take in more territory to survive. You need nourishment to survive. And so that's kind of how countries survive, is they take over territory. Mackinder's Heartland theory is a land-based theory, and Mackinder argued that any state that controls this area he called the Heartland, which is also considered Eurasia, could dominate the entire world. And he argued this in 1904. And the reason why the Heartland is such a great place is, number one, it has a large amount of arable land. And he says that Eurasia could produce enough wheat and other agricultural products to sustain a large population. So without any imports or exports, they could sustain themselves from their arable land. He also argued that there are abundant raw materials in this specific heartland, Eurasia, and that could help whoever controlled this area develop a military and industrial base to kind of conquer everywhere else and protect themselves. He also argued that this area was inaccessible to sea invasion because the only ocean coast is here in the north, and it's actually frozen over. And he argued that the Heartland would be at an advantageous position for a land-based invasion from the Rimland. So the impact of this Heartland theory is seen through Hitler and Stalin. So Hitler invaded Russia in an attempt to gain this Heartland territory. And remember, the Soviet Union also took over the majority of Eastern Europe during the Cold War. So there are some problems with this theory. First of all, it severely overestimates the power of Eurasia. He did not take into account that the interior of Eurasia is largely not arable land. So there's a lot of frozen patches, there are deserts, as well as extensive and dense forestry. So it's not as arable as he claimed it was. Lastly, he didn't take into account new military technology. So in the present day, you don't have to have a navy to invade. We have things like ballistic missiles, airplane warfare, and drones. And so the big thing here is that Mackinder was thinking like an environmental determinist, right? That our environment determines our destiny. And we know now that humans can adapt to their environment, which is called possibilism. Okay, so Spykman is very similar to Mackinder, but he comes about 40 years later in 1942. And he uses Mackinder's ideas to create his own theory about world domination. And he said that forming alliances would be necessary to keep this heartland in check, so to stop this heartland from expanding. And because it is so powerful, no individual country could contain it by itself. So he argued that if there were alliances created in this RIMLAND, that they could control the sea around the heartland and kind of absorb and take over this heartland, kind of trapping it. He had an impact as well because Spikeman really impacted the growth of military organizations during the Cold War, like NATO. So the idea was the containment policy, which is to contain the spread of communism coming from the Soviet Union. So the United States actually used Spikeman's theory. The next idea is the Shatterbelt theory. This was in 1950, and Saul Cohen came up with this idea of the Shatterbelt, which I'm going to explain to you, but first let me explain how he replaced these terminologies. The heartland he calls the pivot area, and he called the rimland the inner crescent. In the rest of the world, he considered called the outer crescent. And so he argued that Cold War conflicts are going to occur within this inner crescent, and they are going to occur in geopolitically weak states. And these geopolitically weak states are called shatterbelts. So a shatterbelt is a state or group of states that exist within some type of competition between larger states. And so examples of this are during World War II, Russia and Germany both fought over Poland. So Poland would be considered a shatterbelt. Other shatterbelts that happened during the Cold War are Eastern European states. Remember that there was a war in Korea as well as Vietnam during the Cold War. So this leads us to the Cold War policies of containment in the domino theory. Remember, containment is just the idea of containing the spread of communism from expanding politically and militarily. And so this is the idea that military organizations have to stop that. And this is how some of these conflicts break out in the shatterbelts. The second theory here, the domino theory, is that if one state falls to communism, then their neighbors might fall to communism as well. So both of these U.S. policies were severely influenced by the previous theories that we just talked about. So Wallerstein is the last geopolitical theorist that you need to know. He wrote in the 1970s, and he argued that there is a global order, and he called it the world economy. You can see right here. And the world economy was based on a colonial history, that this world economy was created among states because they had huge differences in economic and political wealth due to colonialism. And so he argued that the economy is broken up into three different tiers. That first tier is called the core. This is countries that have high levels of education, high salaries, a lot of technology, and they generate a lot of wealth, and they contribute to the world economy. So examples of these states are the United States, Western Europe, Japan, Australia. The periphery states are where there are lower levels of education, low salaries, less technology, and they generate less wealth than those core countries. And so examples of periphery countries are like sub-Saharan Africa, some of Southwest Asia, and Southeast Asia. The semi-periphery is in this middle position. It's places where the core and the periphery are both occurring at the same time. And so the idea is the semi-periphery is exploited by the core. So the core is better off than the semi-periphery, but they also take advantage of those periphery states themselves. And so you can see here the periphery is contributing cheap labor and raw materials to the semi-periphery, but the semi-periphery is also taking in these high profits in consumption goods. So it's kind of like a middle ground. And so examples of these countries are like China, India, Brazil, Mexico. And so When you think about this, you can think about the core countries being most developed, the periphery countries being the developing countries, and the semi-peripheries being somewhere in between. Okay, supranationalism. Supranationalism is when we see an increased amount of cooperation among states. So there are like some global or regional centripetal forces bringing states together. And the official definition of supranationalism is an organization of 3 or more states that come together to pursue common goals. These common goals can be military goals, economic goals, or environmental goals. And so states do have to give up some of their sovereignty. They have to give up some of the say in what they do, but there are benefits to being a part of these organizations. There's actually been research done that shows that participation in supranational organizations is so helpful to the people who are actually in the organization, and that being left out can have serious negative consequences. And so on a global scale, an example of a supranational organization is the United Nations, and on a regional scale, the European Union. So the foundations of supranationalism come from the United States, specifically Woodrow Wilson. After World War I, Woodrow Wilson proposed the League of Nations, which was an association of countries, a global alliance to help prevent any future war from ever happening again. The U.S. actually never even joined this League of Nations, and it collapsed right before World War II began. However, it did lead to the creation of the United Nations, which is still around today. And some geographers consider it the most important global organization. So the United Nations is a global scale example of a supranational organization. There are 193 members, and their intentions or the purpose of this organization is to promote international cooperation in a few different realms. The UN addresses global economic problems. They promote human rights. They provide and promote humanitarian relief, and they also have an international court of justice, so settling disputes between nations. So participation actually commits these different countries to act a certain way. And when states violate those rules or those standards, there can be collective action taken against them. And so this is the biggest and the most global example. A regional example is the EU. And this is an economic organization, and it's actually considered one of the world's leading superpowers because it turned Europe into the world's wealthiest market. So the task of the EU is to promote development within member states through economic and political cooperation. As of now, there are 28 members, and several more European countries have applied for membership. So what's important to know is that the European Union, the countries who are members, are connected, and there is free movement of people, goods, services, and capital. Free movement of people, goods, services, and capital. And so the first thing that promotes that is that all of the EU countries use the euro, a common currency. Secondly, the free movement of people is allowed because there are open borders in the European Union, which means you don't have to show a passport or go through any border crossing process when you go between countries. In addition to that, there is open immigration from all EU member states. What allows the free movement of goods is that there aren't any taxes or tariffs that are charged on goods or services that cross borders. So by eliminating these fees, European businesses have a leg up because they can save money and become more competitive on a global scale. So another example of regional supranational organizations are NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and the African Union.